Hello everyone, I'm Kevin Fandel, and today we're going to talk about contracts. Let's get started.
Let's begin with a refresher on unilateral and bilateral offers. Remember that a unilateral offer is made so that it can be accepted only by performance. This means that the offeree cannot promise to comply. The offeree must actually comply in order to form a valid contract. A bilateral contract, on the other hand, can be formed by both parties making a promise to the other to perform. Bilateral contracts are much more common, and they create obligations at the moment both promises have been made. Just like the contract itself, the offer has four distinct elements. Each of the elements in the offer must be clear and definite, which means that none of them may be equivocal or uncertain. Those four elements are price, quantity, parties, and subject matter. This means that for an offer to be valid, it must have a clear and definite price, it must identify how many of the object or services are available, it must clearly designate the parties that are able to accept the contract, and it must define the subject matter upon which the contract is made. In addition, all of these terms must be communicated to the offeree. The offeree cannot hear it through a third party and still accept. It is also important to remember that advertisements, in general, are not offers, but rather are invitations to negotiate. However, in cases in which an advertisement is precise and leaves nothing left to negotiate, acceptance of that promise may form a valid contract. This is most common today in online contracts, such as one-click purchases. Let's take a closer look at advertisements with our key precedent on point, Lefkowitz versus Great Minneapolis Surplus Store. This 1957 case involves Mr. Lefkowitz, who saw an ad in his local newspaper for a black Lepine stole, which is similar to a scarf, and it's made typically for women. The advertisement contained all of the essential elements of an offer. It contained the price, the subject matter, the parties, and the quantity. The only element that was not quite certain was the parties. We can surmise that the parties were identified because it says first come, first served. And if you've heard this expression before, you know that it generally means the first individual to arrive when the store opens would be the first one to receive the offer. As you can imagine, Mr. Lefkowitz was the first one at the store when it opened, and he marched immediately to the desk to request his stole for $1. The store refused to sell him the stole, claiming that they had a house rule that only women could purchase women's clothing, and thus only women were entitled to the stole. Mr. Lefkowitz sued, and in this case, the court held that the store had provided sufficient detail and every element necessary in order to form a valid and binding contract. Therefore, their advertisement became an offer, and Mr. Lefkowitz accepted when he tendered the $1 at the store on the day that it opened. We will now turn our attention to acceptance. Much like the offer, the acceptance requires that both parties intend to be bound by the contract, and in this case it is the offeree who we're asking to show intent. In addition, the acceptance must mirror the offer. What this means is that the acceptance may not contain any additional language that would qualify or create conditions on the offer itself. The acceptance must be a clear and outright acceptance of the offer as stated. We will see shortly that the rule on acceptance is different for common law contracts and UCC contracts. One additional element is that the acceptance must be communicated to the offeror. That is, if the offeror does not hear in a reasonable manner of the offeree's acceptance, there is no contract. The strict rules of acceptance under the common law don't apply when we're working within UCC contracts. Article 2-207 of the UCC, which again deals with contracts for the sale of goods, has much more flexibility in how a contract can be formed and how an acceptance is made. For example, even if the offeror stipulates that acceptance must be made only by certain mediums, such as mail or fax or telephone, the offeree is permitted to accept in any way they see fit that would be considered reasonable. In addition, unlike the mirror image rule of the common law, even if an acceptance contains additional terms or conditions, while that does not create a contract because it is not a clear acceptance, it also does not terminate the negotiation. Additional terms are simply treated as proposals that the offeror is permitted to accept or reject, but the negotiation goes on. Finally, the UCC recognizes that conduct by the parties can be sufficient to form a valid contract. That is, there is no outright acceptance that's necessary if the offeree acts in a manner that would show evidence of acceptance. In no instance under the common law may silence serve as acceptance. An offeror will not be able to form a contract by asking for a non-response to constitute an acceptance from the offeree. However, non-response plus performance that indicates acceptance, even under the common law, would be sufficient to form a valid contract. Let's turn briefly to the mailbox rule. The mailbox rule deals with contracts that are formed over the mail, that is, through the U.S. Postal Service or some other service. In this case that you see on your screen, Morrison v. Thelke, we have one party located in Florida and another one located in Texas. An offer is made through the mail, and acceptance is also made through the mail. However, while the acceptance is in transit to the offeror telephones the offeree to revoke the offer. Now, typically, if an offer is revoked prior to being accepted, it cannot possibly form a valid contract. However, in this case, because the offer was accepted and placed in the custody of the U.S. Postal Service before it was revoked, the contract was validly formed. In other words, as soon as you place your written acceptance in the custody of the Postal Service or a similar transit service, you have formed a valid contract, and any other form of revocation would not be valid. Now let's assume that somebody has made an offer that they wish to revoke. What are the ways in which we can do that? There are several ways to terminate an offer. The first one is outright revocation. That is, letting the offeree know prior to acceptance that the offer is no longer valid. Another possibility, at least within the common law, is rejection. When the offeree says, "No, I don't want that offer," that terminates the negotiation and terminates the offer. Time lapse means that the offer will expire after a reasonable period of time. How much is a reasonable period of time? That generally depends on what the offer is about. An offer for fresh fruit might expire relatively quickly, whereas an offer for construction services might last for a little bit longer. The last way that an offer can be revoked before acceptance is through some other legal event, such as the death or incapacity of the offeror, a supervening illegality, which means that, in some sense, the law has changed and the offer is no longer valid, or by the destruction of the subject matter itself, meaning that an offer can no longer be accepted. All of these terminate the offer process. It is important to note that the offeror is the master of their offer, and they have great flexibility in how the offer can be accepted and when it can be revoked. The offeror sets the terms for the offer, and prior to acceptance, can revoke the offer for any reason whatsoever. This is crucial in understanding the formation process, because once the offeree has accepted, the offer no longer exists and a contract has been formed. Now that we've laid down the basics of the offer and acceptance process, it's good to test our knowledge and make sure that we understand how these subjects work in a practical context. For that reason, I present you with the plumber hypothetical. After several days of negotiations, owner wrote to plumber, "We'll pay you $3,000 if you will install new plumbing in my office building according to the specifications I have sent you. I must have your reply by March 30. Plumber replied by a letter that owner received on March 15th. We'll not do it for less than $3,500. On March 20, plumber wrote to owner again, saying, "I have changed my mind. I will do the work for $3,000. Unless I hear from you to the contrary, I will begin work on April 5th. Owner received this letter on March 22nd, but did not reply. Without owner's knowledge, plumber began the work on April 5th. Take a moment to think about the terms of this offer and whether a contract was formed. If one was formed, when was it formed? This will test all of the lessons that we've worked on thus far. I'll give you 30 seconds to think about it. All done? Great. Hopefully, you've come to the conclusion that no contract was formed whatsoever. In fact, the plumber had given the office owner, that is, owner, a counteroffer. And because we're using the common law here, since this is a service, the common law tells us that a counteroffer is actually a rejection of the original offer. This means that it terminated negotiations right at that point. So the additional statements made by plumber about how he was willing to do the work for a lower price were offers, new offers in themselves. And since owner never accepted those new offers, no contract could have been formed. When plumber began working, expecting that silence of the owner meant acceptance, we know that no contract had been in place. And so the plumber's work was in fact a gift to the owner, since he was working under the auspices of no contract at all.
Thank you for your attention and for your interest in studying contracts with me.